Hey guys, tonight we're not going to a battlefield, or a throne room, or a haunted cathedral. No grand intrigues, no shocking betrayals. Instead, we're going to stand, for a very long time, in the single busiest, warmest, and arguably most important room in any medieval castle, manor, or cottage. We're going to the kitchen, and we're going to examine, in exhaustive, soul-soothing detail, the tools they used and the daily routines they followed. This is the history of pre-meal prep, the saga of simmering, a ballad of bread. So get comfortable. Dim those lights. Maybe grab a light snack, though perhaps not a medieval one, for reasons that will become quietly, slowly apparent. And let's just step into the smoke. Our story begins, as all good medieval stories do, not with a person, but with an architectural feature, the hearth. This wasn't a cute fireplace with a mantelpiece for family photos. This was a vast, open, central rectangle of stone or brick, often in the middle of the hall itself in earlier periods, or later, in a separate but adjacent kitchen room. The smoke from this beast would ideally drift up to a hole in the roof, a theory that worked better in theory than in practice. The result was a perpetually sooty, warm, and dim environment. Imagine a large campfire, but indoors, and it's been burning for 30 years. This is your stage. Everything orbits this roaring, temperamental sun, and presiding over this sun, like a priestess of a very specific cult, was the cook. In a large household, this was often a man, a professional of some repute, but in most places, it was the lady of the house or her most trusted servants. Their domain was defined not by counters and cabinets, but by a collection of tools that were, by modern standards, profoundly blunt, heavy, and multipurpose in the way a rock is multipurpose. It's a tool. You can hit things with it, weigh things down with it, or throw it at a pest. Versatility through sheer, simplistic mass. Let's start with the most iconic piece, the cauldron. Of course it was a cauldron. This wasn't a dainty little saucepan. This was a colossal, blackened iron pot, thick as a knight's skull, suspended by a chain or perched on a trivet directly over the fire. It lived in the fire. It was part of the fire. Its contents were always either barely tepid or at a volcanic rolling boil. There was no simmer setting. You had over the direct flames, or off to the side in the ashes. The cauldron was the medieval multi-cooker. Into it went everything: water for boiling grains, broth for pottage, cuts of meat both fine and suspicious, and a bewildering array of vegetables, most of which we consider animal feed today. It was a one-pot wonder, a perpetual stew that might, in some households, have a theoretical base broth that was simply topped up for weeks. A sort of historical sourdough starter, but made of meat scraps and turnip essence. Next to the cauldron, you'd find its trusted companion, the dripping pan, a wide, shallow dish placed beneath roasting meat on a spit. Its purpose was simple: catch the fat. And this fat, this liquid gold, was not wasted. It was used for frying, for basting, for making sauces, or just sopped up with bread as a delicious, cardiovascular crisis-inducing treat. The spits themselves were formidable mechanisms. For a small bird, a simple hand-turned rod. For a whole ox or boar, you'd need a clockwork-driven spit, powered by a small dog running on a treadmill in a nearby cage. A truly medieval solution: enslave a smaller animal to cook a larger one. Efficiency. Now, let's move to the cutting surface. There were no composite rubber boards. The most common surface was a simple, thick slab of wood, a trestle table. Or, more intriguingly, a trencher. A trencher was, initially, not a plate, but a plate's predecessor. A stale, thick slice of coarse bread, usually day-old, cut into a rough square. It served as an edible plate. The juices and sauces from your meal would soak into it, and after you'd eaten the top layer off, you could eat the plate itself, or give it to the dogs, or to the alms bowl for the poor. A tidy, zero-waste system, assuming you didn't mind eating something that had absorbed a puddle of greasy mutton drippings. Later, trenchers evolved into square slabs of worn wood, reused and scrubbed, growing ever more aromatic with the ghosts of meals past. The cutting tools were, of course, knives. Everyone carried their own personal knife, sharpened on a whetstone. The kitchen would have larger, heftier versions. But the key thing to remember is that they were carbon steel, and they dulled fast, and sharpening was a chore. So, much cutting and chopping was done with a determined, sawing motion rather than a graceful chef's chop. Imagine mincing a pile of onions with a slightly blunt pocket knife. Now imagine doing that for 40 people, every single day. It lends a certain grim determination to the historical culinary face. For grinding and mashing, the mortar and pestle reigned supreme, not just for herbs and spices, but for pounding nuts into paste, crushing grains, smashing fruits for preserves, or pulverizing hard lumps of salt or sugar, if you were obscenely wealthy. This was manual food processing. It was loud, monotonous, and arm-making work. The rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk would be a core kitchen soundtrack, alongside the crackle of the fire and the sporadic cursing of someone who'd brushed against a searing hot pot handle. And we mustn't forget the humble pottery. Jugs for water, ale, or milk. Crude ceramic pots for storage. Saucepans called pipkins with 3 legs, designed to stand right in the embers. These were the fragile members of the kitchen orchestra. A dropped iron cauldron would maybe dent the floor. A dropped pipkin was a shower of pottery shards and a day's worth of sauce gone. A quiet, ceramic tragedy. So, that's our stage and our key players. A smoky, roaring hearth. A few gigantic, indestructible iron implements. An array of simple, personal blades. And a lot of heavy, repetitive motion. From this humble, smoky arsenal, an entire society was fed. The routines built around these tools were not about culinary excellence, but about volume, preservation, and getting enough calories into a lot of people without, ideally, poisoning them. The drama was not in the flavor profile, but in the logistics. The endless, sleepy cycle of grain to gruel, animal to stew, dough to bread. A cycle we'll drift into next, as we follow a day in this sooty, warm world, from the first pre-dawn kneading of dough to the final scraping of the trencher into the slop bucket. But for now, just picture that hearth. Always burning, always waiting. The hungry, eternal heart of the home.
We've seen the tools of the medieval kitchen lying there in the smoky half-light. But tools are just potential. The real story is in the motion, the daily, unending rhythm that turned raw, often dubious ingredients into something called dinner. This wasn't cooking as a high-minded art form. This was cooking as a form of slow, deliberate combustion, much like the fire it depended on. It all started not with a flash of inspiration, but with the first creak of a servant's bones before dawn. In a large household, the day began in the cold, pitch-black dark. A scullion, the lowest of the low in the kitchen hierarchy, often just a child permanently smudged with soot and grime, had the job of reviving the hearth. The embers from the night before were carefully coaxed back to life with kindling and bellows. That first crackle of renewed flame was the true alarm clock of the medieval world. No rooster crowed earlier than this kitchen fire. With the fire established, the first and most sacred task began: baking. Bread was the absolute, non-negotiable foundation of the medieval diet. For most people, it practically was the meal, often accounting for 70% of their daily calories. So the baker would start with the sourdough starter, the barm, saved from yesterday's batch. This was mixed with flour, water, and salt in a massive trough. The quality of that flour varied wildly. For the lord and lady, it was manchat, a fine white wheat bread. For everyone else, it was cheat or even horse bread made from mixed grains like rye, barley, and sometimes even ground up peas or beans. The resulting dough was dense, dark, and built to last. It was also capable of causing dental wear we can only imagine. Kneading this much dough was a serious feat of strength. It wasn't a gentle pressing. It was a full-body workout, heaving and slamming the massive, glutinous mass in the trough. Once kneaded, it was left to rise in a warm corner near the hearth. A slow, yeasty expansion that took hours. Then it was shaped into rounds, scored with a simple cross to let the devil out, or to help it bake. Take your pickhand, loaded into the oven. Ah, the oven. This was usually a separate, dome-shaped stone or brick structure, often in an outbuilding to reduce the risk of fire. It had its own mini ritual. First, a fire was built directly inside it, heating the stones to a furious temperature. Once it was white hot, the embers and ashes were raked out. The interior was quickly swept with a wet mop to clear debris, and the loaves were slid in on a long, flat paddle called a peel. The door was sealed with clay, and the bread baked in the intense, radiating heat. It was a high-stakes dance. Too hot, and the loaves charred. Too cool, and they emerged as doughy, inedible bricks. Dacre's reputation lived and died by the sound a loaf made when tapped. A hollow thump meant success. A dull thud was disaster. While the bread baked, the main kitchen slowly filled with people and purpose. The day's water had to be drawn from the well or cisterna, heavy, endless task. Serfs or tenants would arrive to deliver their dues. Maybe a scrawny hen, a bundle of winter carrots, a sack of milled grain. The cook or the steward would inspect it all with a practiced, cynical eye. Absolutely nothing was wasted. Vegetable peelings, meat trimmings, stale bread, and it all went into the bowl for the pigs or into the stockpot to give it. Let's call it character. The modern concept of 3 distinct meals was really only for the wealthy. Peasants might have a quick breakfast of ale and bread, a midday dinner, and a light supper. But in the castle, there were 2 main events. Dinner, served between 10 a.m. and noon, and supper around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. The kitchen's whole frenzied operation was geared towards that late morning dinner. And the star of that show, if there was to be one, was meat. Butchering, if not done by a dedicated specialist, was a kitchen task. It was messy, bloody, and conducted with those sturdy, slightly dull knives. A carcass was broken down, not into neat, plastic-wrapped cuts, but into functional pieces, joints for roasting, tougher bits for the cauldron, and offal for immediate use or for pies. Remember, there was no refrigeration. So meat was either cooked today, preserved, or risked. Preservation meant smoking, salting in huge barrels, or drying. But for today's dinner, fresh meat was a luxury, and roasting it was the ultimate display of wealth. Fuel was expensive. A roaring fire just to cook a single piece of meat. That was power. That was status. So the chosen joined a leg of mutton, a side of pork, maybe even a swan, if it was a really big day, would be impaled on the spit. A young kitchen boy, the spit boy, would then be consigned to his personal treadmill of torment, turning it for what must have felt like an eternity. Heat basted with its own fat, which collected in the dripping pan below. The smell would permeate the entire castle, a tantalizing, greasy beacon signaling the Lord's generosity, or at least his ability to afford a continuous fire. Meanwhile, the great cauldron bubbled away. Into it went the pottage. This is a term so wonderfully vague. It could be a thin, watery gruel of oats and a single, wistful piece of leek. Or, in a rich house, a thick stew of meat, pulses, and vegetables, all heavily spiced. It was different every day, yet somehow always the same. It was the background noise of medieval nutrition, simmering from morning until serving, a constant, bubbling companion to every other kitchen activity. And what about vegetables? They weren't celebrated side dishes. They were ingredients added to the pottage, or sometimes boiled separately into a mushy puree. Salads existed, but they were considered suspect, cold, raw plants. That was for peasants in desperate times, or for medicinal purposes. The medical texts of the day warned that raw fruits and vegetables could unbalance your humors. A cooked apple was safe. A raw one, a risky gamble with your bodily fluids. Spices, for those who could afford them, were literally locked away. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, these were worth more than their weight in silver. They were a display of global reach, of far-flung trade networks. They were also used to mask the flavor of meat that was, let's say, transitioning from fresh to something else. A heavy hand with ginger and pepper could convince the palate of many things. The cook would grind them personally in a mortar, releasing fragrances that spoke of distant, sun-drenched places, a stark contrast to the smoky, damp stone of the kitchen. By mid-morning, the kitchen would be a controlled chaos of heat, steam, and shouted orders. The bread was out, cooling, its crust cracking like distant thunder. The spit turned with a rhythmic squeak. Sauces were being prepared in small pots, mustard, verjuice from unripe grapes, or a sop sauce of wine and spices for the roast. Trenchers were being cut from stale loaves to act as plates. The Lord's salt cellar, a prized possession, was being placed at the high table. Then the call would come from the great hall. Dinner was to be served, and the kitchen's work would transition from creation to logistics, a frantic ballet of carrying heavy vessels upstairs and along drafty corridors, trying to get the hot food to the table before it congealed into a lukewarm mass. But that part of the story, the serving, the seating, and the surprisingly complex etiquette of eating with a knife, a chunk of bread, and your fingers, that's a tale for another time. For now, let's just take a moment to breathe in the lingering scent of smoke, yeast, and slow-cooked meat. A scent that was, for centuries, the very smell of security, of another day fed. Another day survived. Ever wonder what a real medieval feast was like? Forget what you see in the movies. The call from the hall wasn't a dinner bell. It was a shouted relay that started with a steward's nod and ended with a kitchen clerk bellowing, "Serve forth," into a cloud of steam. This was the moment of quiet panic. All that slow, simmering preparation now condensed into a frantic few minutes. The kitchen, for all its heat and industry, was often separate from the great hall. This meant a procession, a slow, careful, grease-spotted parade. First, the servers' young men, learning courtesy, or trusted servants, would assemble. They'd wash their hands, a small ritual, before touching the Lord's food. Then the dance began. The massive cauldron of pottage was heaved off its hook, its contents ladled into smaller, more presentable serving bowls. These bowls, made of wood or fine ceramics, were heavy, hot, and sloshy. Carrying one across a rushes-strewn floor, up a spiral staircase, and into a crowded hall required a steady hand and a resigned acceptance of minor burns. The roast was the crown jewel. The spitboy's duty finally over, the meat would be carefully slid off the rod onto a vast platter. A charger, the dripping pan, full of glorious, savory fat, would be skimmed. Some fat went into a sauce, the rest saved. The platter, bearing this magnificent, crackling, aromatic burden, was carried aloft by the head server or the carver himself. This was the flagship of the edible armada. Next came the bread. Great loaves, now cool enough to handle, were loaded into baskets. The trencher's plates made of stale bread were already at the tables, but finer bread for eating accompanied the meal. Then the accompaniments: small bowls of salt, dishes of mustard, sauces in little pots, maybe a cooked fruit puree. Each item required a separate trip. Imagine a silent, solemn Uber Eats service, but with no bags, only bare hands and a prayer not to trip. This journey itself was a vulnerability. In the corridors, dogs would materialize, eyes pleading. A passing courtier might snatch a tidbit, claiming it was foretasting, for poison, a classic excuse for a snack. The draft would cool the food with every step. By the time the procession entered the vast, noisy, great hall, the pottage was no longer bubbling, and the roast had begun to sweat its heat away. The hall was a universe of strict hierarchy, and the food mirrored it perfectly. The lord and lady sat at the high table on a raised dais with their most honored guests. Before them went the best of everything, the finest white bread, the choicest cuts of roast, the most heavily spiced dishes, and their own private salt cellar, sometimes an elaborate silver piece called a nef. Salt was power. To sit above the salt was to be in the inner circle. To sit below it, down among the lesser knights and household staff, was to be in the culinary hinterlands. The lower tables got the trickle down. Their pottage was from the same cauldron, but with more broth and less meat. Their bread was the darker, coarser kind. Their share of the roast was the lesser cuts, the shank, the parts that required more chewing. Their salt was in a humble, communal dish. Servers navigated this geography with practiced precision, a silent, edible map of the entire social order. Now, with the food finally deposited, the eating could begin. And here, we must abandon all modern utensils. Why spear your food like a demon when God gave you fingers? The toolkit was simple. Your personal knife, a spoon for pottage, your trencher, and your hands. Always your hands. Let's watch a typical diner. They'd take their knife and cut a piece of meat from the shared platter. They'd place it on their trencher, then use their knife and fingers to eat it, sopping up juices with bits of bread. Pottage was eaten directly from the bowl with a spoon, or by dipping bread into it. It was a tactile, communal, and frankly, messy affair. Bones were tossed over the shoulder to the floor for the ever-present dogs. Grease shone on hands and faces. Napkins existed, but were more for wiping fingers and knives than for dainty laps. Conversation, music from a minstrel's gallery, and the din of people eating filled the hall. The meal was a social performance as much as a nutritional one, but by our standards, it was surprisingly fast. Once the food was there, you ate. It was getting cold, after all. There was no lingering over courses. You ate your fill of what was in front of you, and then the next wave of food might arrive, or the meal might simply be over. And what of the cook, the architect of this entire endeavor? They likely did not dine in the hall. Their reward was the quiet aftermath, a chance to finally sit by the hearth they'd commanded all day, to perhaps have a bowl of the pottage. and a chunk of the good bread saved for them by a sympathetic server. For a brief moment, their domain was silent. The fires banked. The cauldron, empty and scoured with sand and water, hung cold. The spits were clean. But the silence was deceptive, because even as the last of the supper ale was drunk in the hall, and the trenchers were collected disdained, sauce-soaked bread given to the poor or the pigs the kitchen's work was never truly done. The starter for tomorrow's bread had to be set aside, the ashes from the oven cleared, the leftover meat stored in the coolest larder, perhaps sealed with a layer of fat. The planning for the next day began before the current one's grease had been wiped from the tables. It was a cycle with no weekend, no vacation. A rhythm dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the endless human need to fill a belly. A rhythm of smoke, sweat, and slow, deliberate consumption. And at the heart of it all, that simple, devastatingly limited toolkit: the pot, the fire, the knife, the stone, from which empires were fueled and around which daily life, in all its gritty, unglamorous reality, forever turned. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the past, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more historical deep dives. See you next time. Let's leave behind the relative abundance of the castle kitchen for a moment. With its bustling activity, its spits turning, and its air thick with the scent of spices. Let's drift out like a wisp of smoke across the courtyard, over the high stone walls, and into the village that huddles around the castle's feet. Here, a kitchen isn't a dedicated room. It's a corner of a one-room hut. The centerpiece is a simple hearth dug into the packed earth floor, with smoke escaping through a rough hole in the thatched roof. The tools are the same in name, but brutally basic in form. A small iron pot, a crude knife, maybe a wooden spoon, and a flat stone for grinding grain. And, of course, the ever-present, all-consuming fire. In this world, cooking wasn't about presentation or impressing guests. It was a silent, daily war fought against two relentless enemies: starvation and spoilage. The castle had larders, deep cellars, and the wealth to preserve food on a massive scale, creating a buffer against lean times. The peasant household had no such luxury. Their existence was a huntomed rhythm in a most literal sense, dictated by the agonizingly slow turn of the agricultural year. While the castle chef worried about the perfect sauce, the peasant cook was engaged in a deep, slow-time science of not letting anything go to waste, which, of course, it constantly threatened to do. Let's talk about preservation, the true, unsung heroism of medieval food. Meat was a rare and precious thing: pig, slaughtered after the first frost. A trapped hare, maybe a scrawny old cow. It couldn't all be eaten fresh. It had to last the winter. So it was salted, packed into barrels with layers of precious salt crystals that drew out moisture, making it an unwelcome place for bacteria to grow. Then it was hung in the smokehouse, where the cool smoke from smoldering hardwoods like oak or apple would coat it, dry it, and infuse it with compounds that stalled decay even further. The result: a piece of meat as tough as leather and as salty as the sea, which had to be soaked and boiled for hours just to be remotely edible. It was food as a culinary time capsule waiting to be opened in the desperate, hungry depths of February. This meant that a daily or weekly chore was milling it into flour. Now, the lord of the manor owned the watermill, and of course, he did. So you had to take your grain there, pay a portion of it for the service, and have it ground. This was a major point of control, and often of deep resentment. But in smaller, poorer households, they might rely on a hand quern, 2 round stones, the top one turned by a long handle. Your daily bread, therefore, contained a fine mineral supplement, whether you wanted it or not. This grit wore down teeth with a quiet, ruthless efficiency over a lifetime. The peasant's daily meal was a monument to monotony. Breakfast, if you even had one, might be something called cabbage water, literally the warm, nutrient water left over from boiling vegetables, maybe with a stale crust of bread soaked in it. The eating utensils were an even more stripped-down version of those in the Great Hall. Each person might have a personal wooden bowl and a spoon. You used your fingers. Sometimes a thick slice of stale bread, called a trencher, would serve as a plate, which you could then eat. But often, the pottage was eaten directly from the shared cooking pot. The family would gather around the hearth, dipping their spoons into the communal meal. It was a scene of profound intimacy, born from profound scarcity. The fire was smaller, the light was dimmer, the smoke was harsher, but that hearth was still the heart of the home. It was the only source of heat, the only source of cooked food, the literal light in the darkness. And this is where we see the true, quiet drama of the medieval kitchen in both the castle and the cottage. It was a theater of transformation, yes, but more than that, it was the front line in a constant battle against entropy and decay. Every single day, raw, perishable, and often unpalatable ingredients were brought into the sphere of the fire. And through slow, repetitive, ancient processes, soaking, salting, smoking, boiling, grinding, they were transformed into something that could sustain human life for another day, another season. The cook, whether a lord's master, chef, or a peasant wife, was an alchemist. Their philosopher's stone was heat. Their great work was holding off decay for one more meal. Success was the simple, uncelebrated fact of survival. So, the next time you see a picture of a quaint medieval cottage or a romanticized castle feast, look past the colorful banners and the fine clothes. See the soot staining the ceiling. Feel the ache in the arms of the woman turning the hand quern. Smell not just roasting meat, but the pungent, necessary scent of fermenting cabbage and the acrid tang of a wood fire that has burned for a lifetime. It was a world built, quite literally, on the ability to keep a fire lit and to wield a pot. A slow, smoky, grinding world where the greatest luxury wasn't spice, but security. The certainty that when the winter winds howled, there was something, however humble, bubbling in the pot over the fire. That was the true masterpiece of the medieval kitchen. Not a grand feast, but continuity. One slow, simmering day after another. Let's step away from the kitchen for a bit, because no medieval kitchen, whether in a smoky hut or a chaotic castle, existed on its own. It was the final stop in a huge, slow, and often hilariously corrupt supply chain. Every single ingredient, from the lord's fancy peppercorns to the peasant's handful of barley, had to travel. And that journey is a story, all its own a story, less about recipes and more about ledgers. less about flavor and more about fraud. So, let's head to where the medieval world did its grocery shopping, the marketplace. Picture it on a market day, usually once a week. The quiet town square completely transforms into a riot of noise, smell, and controlled chaos. You'd see pens of anxious sheep and grunting pigs, cages of clucking chickens and confused geese. Tables would be groaning under wheels of cheese, slabs of butter wrapped in leaves, and baskets of eggs nestled in straw. There are piles of vegetables already looking a bit tired from their journey, and sacks of grain folded open for everyone to inspect. And then there are the fishmongers, hopefully downwind, selling the day's catch from the river or sea fish that, let's be honest, is on a very strict timeline. This is where the fate of the kitchen is decided. The castle's steward, or a trusted cook's assistant, is here, purse in hand, eyes full of skepticism. The peasant housewife is here with a few eggs or some spun wool, hoping to trade for a new pot. And watching over everyone are the market officials, because in the medieval mind, a marketplace was not a free-for-all. It was a meticulously regulated system designed to protect the buyer, ensure the town got its taxes, and prevent, well, murder by bad pork. The regulations were incredibly specific, written with the kind of paranoia that comes from being cheated one too many times. Let's take bread, the sacred staple of life. Most towns had laws called bread assizes. These laws dictated the exact weight, quality, and price of a loaf based on the current price of grain. A baker couldn't just charge whatever he wanted. If grain was cheap, loaves had to be bigger. If grain was expensive, loaves could be smaller, but the price stayed the same. This was to stop bakers from getting rich during a famine. Of course, this led to bakers getting creative. The classic trick was selling underweight loaves, and this is where the baker's dozen comes from. You'd give 13 loaves for the price of 12. So, if you were caught with one loaf being a bit light, the extra one hopefully made up for it. It was a built-in margin of error or fraud, depending on how you look at it. Then there was the ale. Brewing was often done by women known as brewsters or alewives, but you couldn't just sell any old fermented slop. An ale conner or ale taster was appointed by the town. His job was to visit brewers, taste their product, and make sure it was wholesome, strong enough, and sold at the right price. A common method was to pour some ale on a wooden bench and then sit on it in his leather pants. If his pants stuck to the bench, it meant the ale had enough sugar and was probably decent. If they didn't stick, the ale was too weak. That was medieval quality control. judging alcohol content by the stickiness of your trousers. Meat was a whole other minefield. Butchers were seen as both necessary and deeply suspicious. Regulations forbade selling meat from animals that had died of disease. Though some butchers had a very creative definition of died of disease, they couldn't sell old meat as fresh. So they did try to pass off yesterday's grain cut by rubbing it with fresh blood or herbs. Selling cat or horse as pork or veal was such a common fear that laws specifically banned it. Butcher stalls also had to be downstream from the town's water supply for obvious reasons. And oh, the fishmonger. Fish was essential for fast days like Fridays and the long weeks of Lent when the church forbade eating meat. This created a huge demand. Fishmongers sold fresh catch, but also preserved fish like stockfish, which was rock-hard dried cod from Scandinavia, and barrels of salted herring. The potential for fraud here was legendary. They might soak the dried stockfish to make it weigh more, or pack the bottom of a herring barrel with rotten fish and put the good ones on top. It was a constant, soggy battle of wits. Watching over all this were the guild wardens. The guilds for bakers, butchers, brewers were less about quality and more about controlling competition. They set standards, yes, but they also limited who could sell what. Fixed prices to protect their members and basically tried to corner the market. They were medieval cartels with fancy hats. A baker from another town might have his bread confiscated just for not meeting the local guild. Make fake standards for the average buyer. Navigating the market was a skill. You poked the meat. You sniffed the fish, always a mistake. You hefted the loaf of bread. You looked at the alewife sign, usually a broomstick sticking out from her house, and you took your chances. You haggled, but only within the legal limits. And you accepted a certain level of compromise. A little grit in the flour, a few bugs in the grain, a suspiciously jointed piece of rabbit. The goods bought at the market then began their final journey, carried in baskets or hauled in carts back to the kitchen door. The grain would be stored or ground, the meat butchered or salted down, the fish cooked immediately or preserved for later. The cycle closed. The chaotic, regulated energy of the marketplace transformed back into the slow, deliberate energy of the hearth. So the reality of the kitchen was shaped not just by the fire, but by this weekly economic dance. A dance governed by the fear of scarcity, the fear of fraud, and a sprawling, clumsy attempt to impose order on the messy business of feeding people. It was a system that tried, with limited success, to ensure that when you bought a loaf, it was bread, not sawdust. When you bought ale, it was drinkable, not vinegar. And when you bought beef, it was from a cow, not from something that had recently been pulling a cart. It was imperfect, corrupt, and slow. But it was a system. And in a world that was perpetually just a few meals away from total chaos, that was no small thing. It was the quiet, bureaucratic background noise to the sizzle of the cooking pot. Thanks for joining me on this trip to the medieval market. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more stories from the past. See you next time. For most of us, most of the time, our meals follow a predictable rhythm. But what happens when that rhythm is shattered? In the medieval world, for most days, in most places, the rhythm was a slow, smoky, grayish-brown parade of porridge and bread, dictated by preservation and poverty. But to understand the medieval kitchen in its full, bizarre scope, we have to talk about the days that broke that rhythm. The days that were, in essence, a controlled burn of resources. The feast days. A wedding, a coronation, a major religious holiday, or the visit of an important lord. These were the days when the castle kitchen shifted from a workshop of sustenance to a factory of spectacle. The pottage pot was still there, bubbling away for the servants, but it was now a background actor. Center stage was occupied by a kind of edible theater, an architecture of excess built on a foundation of sheer, mind-numbing labor. The planning for a major feast could begin weeks, even months, in advance. This was a logistical, military campaign. The steward and the cook would meet, not with recipes, but with accounting rolls. How many guests? What's their rank? What can we get from our own lands, and what must we buy? The orders they sent out were monumental. Dozens of barrels of wine and ale, scores of live animals to be fattened, hundreds of eggs, pounds of expensive spices, cartloads of flour. The marketplace would be stripped bare. Then, in the days leading up to the feast, the kitchen would enter a state of perpetual, frantic motion. The normal cycles of baking and brewing were multiplied tenfold. Temporary ovens might be built in the courtyard. Extra cooks and specialized artisans would be hired. A saucerer for sauces, a pottager for soups, a larderer for meat, a confectioner for sweets. The kitchen, already crowded, would become a pressurized hive, thick with steam, shouting, and the ever-present fear of catastrophic failure. The feast wasn't served in courses as we know them. It was a service of removes. A whole set of dishes would be placed on the table all at once. After a while, those dishes would be removed and replaced with an entirely new set. A major feast might have 3, 5, or even more of these services. The first service was often the most substantial: roasted and boiled meat and grand pies. Later services might feature more fanciful dishes, game birds, and sweet tarts. But the food itself was only half the story. The presentation was everything. This is where we enter the realm of the subtlety, or subtlety. These weren't dishes to eat, but sculptures to behold, presented between courses as edible theater. Imagine a castle made of pastry, a stag made of glazed meat, breathing real fire thanks to a bit of camphor in its mouth. A scene from a saint's life rendered in lard and food coloring. These were displays of wealth, so blatant they screamed, "We have so much sugar. We can build a model of Jerusalem with it, just for you to look at for 5 minutes before we take it away." The recipes for the actual food were adventurous. Medieval elite cuisine loved complexity for its own sake. A dish wasn't just roasted chicken. It was chicken Mortimer, which involved boiling the chicken, chopping the meat, mixing it with almonds, sugar, and spices, stuffing it all back into the skin, and then roasting it. It was like a poultry-based Russian doll. Colors were vital. A white dish of chicken and rice, colored with almond milk. A green dish of meat with herbs, ground to a paste. A yellow dish using saffron or egg yolks. The goal was to transform the ingredients into something unrecognizable, to demonstrate the cook's power over nature. And then there were the birds. Oh, the birds. Status was directly proportional to the rarity of your fowl. Chicken was for peasants. Capon was better. Goose was good. But the real prestige lay in the air. Heron, crane, peacock, and swan. These were not delicious. A heron, by all accounts, tasted of fish and was tough as boot leather. But that wasn't the point. The point was the presentation. A peacock or swan would be carefully skinned with its feathers intact, roasted, and then redressed in its own skin and feathers. Its beak would be gilded with gold leaf, and it would be carried into the hall as if in a stately procession, often with a piece of cotton wool in its beak set alight. It was a vision of breathtaking, inedible pageantry. You weren't meant to enjoy the taste. You were meant to be awed by the spectacle and by the Lord's ability to command such a rare creature to his table, even in death. Amidst this, the logistics of service reached a fever pitch. Dozens of servers moved in coordinated waves, timing their entrances to music or fanfare. The carver at the high table became a performing artist, his knife work a demonstration of skill and grace. Every gesture was codified. There were specific ways to carve every bird, to slice every joint of meat. The feast was a reinforcement of the entire social order, played out with spoons and teeth. The lower tables got simpler versions of the spectacle, maybe a nice meat pie instead of a refeathered swan butt. They still participated in the abundance. For one day, the relentless grayness of subsistence was painted in the vibrant, expensive colors of saffron, sugar, and spectacle. But as the last subtlety was paraded out, as the final cup of spiced wine was drunk, and the guests staggered off to bed, the kitchen's work was not done. In fact, it entered a new, more grim phase. The cleanup, the mountains of greasy trenchers, the stacks of dirty platters, the bones, the gristle, the half-eaten sculptures of sugar now melting into sticky puddles. The fires had to be banked. The leftovers salvaged good, meat for the kitchen staff, the rest for charity or the pigs. And then, the next morning, the world would snap back. The hearth would be lit again. The great cauldron would be filled with water and the humble, familiar grains for pottage. The feast was a brilliant, noisy, expansive dream. A blast of heat from the fire. But the fire always settled back into its steady, slow burn. The kitchen, having proven it could orchestrate a fantasy, would return to the more vital, more eternal business of reality, turning the raw stuff of the earth into another day. The splendor was an exception, a flicker. The pottage was the rule. And in that return to the rule, there was a kind of quiet, sooty relief. The performance was over. The work remained. Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into the medieval kitchen as fascinating as I did, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time.
We've spent a long time in the smoke. We've watched the grain become bread, the carcass become stew, the ordinary day become a feast. We've followed the journey from the regulated marketplace to the final scrape of the trencher. But all fires eventually burn down. All kitchens fall silent. And so, as we near the end of our slow, meandering tour, it's time to step back from the hearth's immediate glow and ask the inevitable, sleepy question: what remains? What trace did this entire, sooty, labor-intensive world leave behind? Once the last ember of the Middle Ages cooled, the physical remnants are, like the diet itself, humble and sturdy. Archaeologists don't often find golden platters. They find shards, thousands upon thousands of pottery shards, from coarse, gritty cooking pots to finer jugs. They find the occasional iron object that survived the rust, a knife blade, a cauldron leg, a spit hook. They find the bones, telling a story of butchery and consumption in their cut marks and breaks. They find the dark, organic stains in the earth that mark where a hearth once sat, a permanent shadow of heat and habitation. These are the fingerprints of this daily struggle. Not grand, but pervasive. A world built not on stone monuments, but on broken pottery and ash. More subtly, the medieval kitchen left its mark on language. Our words are littered with its ghosts. Board as in room and board, from the actual board table you ate on. Masterpiece, originally referred to a work submitted to a guild to prove you were a master craftsman. A baker's finest loaf, a brewer's best ale. Pottage evolved into porridge. Trencher gives us trench, that which is cut. Kettle is from the Old Norse kettle, a cauldron. Even our phrase, above the salt, lingers as a metaphor for status. Long after the salt cellar ceased to be a social benchmark, we speak in the faded echoes of that world every day, unaware we're referencing pantry logistics and seating charts. The social structures it reinforced proved harder to erase. The kitchen was the engine of hierarchy, the literal distributor of privilege. The idea that what you eat, and how you eat it, defines your place in the world. That didn't end with the Middle Ages. It just got more complicated. The elaborate manners that developed at the high table evolved into the intricate table etiquette of the Renaissance and later periods. Using a fork started as an odd Italian affectation. a suspicion-laden object that took centuries to become standard, precisely because it was a break from the communal, hands-on medieval style. Every time we set a formal table with specific cutlery for specific courses, we are, in a way, enacting a much more refined version of the castle's coded meal service. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, is in our relationship with time and season. The medieval kitchen was shackled to the sun and the soil in a way we can barely comprehend. You ate what was ripe, what was slaughtered, what was preserved. The calendar was a menu. Spring meant fresh greens and lean times. Late summer and autumn meant abundance, salting, smoking, and brewing for the winter. Winter meant digging into the stores, the grain, the salt meat, the hard cheese. The feast days were the punctuation marks in this long, run-on sentence of subsistence. Our modern world of global supply chains and refrigerated trucks has severed that direct, brutal link. We can have strawberries in December and eat a chicken that never saw the outdoors. The medieval cook would see this not as freedom, but as a kind of terrifying, unnatural magic. For them, time was taste. The taste of a fresh pea in June was a fleeting miracle. The taste of salted pork in March was the taste of foresight and survival. Their palate was a map of the year's labor and weather. We've lost that map, for better and for worse. We've gained convenience and variety, but we've muted a fundamental rhythm. And what of the people? The anonymous figures who populate this story. The red-faced spit boy, the arm-making kneader of dough, the peasant wife stirring the ever-present pot, the sweaty, paranoid feast-master cook? They left no memoirs. Their hopes and frustrations are lost to the same smoke that filled their lungs. We can only infer their lives from the tools they wielded and the rules that bound them. Their legacy is in the sheer, unrecorded fact of continuity. They did the work that allowed everything else, the wars, the prayers, the art, the politics, to happen. They turned the raw chaos of nature into the ordered, if meager, reality of a meal. They were the first and last line of defense against entropy. So, as we finally let the fire burn low, picture not a grand hall, but an empty kitchen after a long day. The last pot is scoured and hung. The last ashes are swept from the oven. The last servant has taken their bowl of pottage and found a spot by the embers. The room is dark, save for that single red glow. It smells of smoke, old grease, and damp stone. It is quiet. This quiet is the true end of our story, not with a bang of a feast, but with the whisper of a resting hearth. It was in these quiet moments, in the daily, uncelebrated return to the basics of fire, pot, and hand, that the medieval world was truly built and sustained. A civilization constructed one slow, simmering meal at a time. A world where the most important history wasn't written on parchment, but was eaten, day after day, from a bowl of simple, steaming pottage, in a room thick with the smoke of survival. And on that thought, we can let the last ember fade to black. The kitchen is closed. The history for tonight is done. Sleep well. Our story, you might think, has a natural end. The fire goes out. The soot settles. The last pottage bowl is washed in cold water. But history, like a good stew, rarely has a clean edge. It simmers into something else. So, let's not leave the kitchen just yet. Let's linger in the doorway and watch as the light, over decades and then centuries, begins to change. The medieval kitchen didn't vanish with a clap of thunder or the signing of a treaty. It faded slowly, like the stubborn scent of smoke in wool. It was modified, piece by piece, innovation by grudging innovation, into something new. This is the story of that fade, the long goodbye to the central hearth. The first crack in the old order wasn't a new tool or food, but an idea, a slow shift in what people valued in domestic space. The great hall, that cavernous multipurpose room where the lord dined with his household and the hearth was the literal and figurative center, began to feel public, drafty, lacking in privacy, starting with the wealthy in the late Middle Ages and picking up pace in the Renaissance. There was a move towards specialized rooms, withdrawing rooms, parlors, libraries, and, crucially, dedicated dining rooms for the family and honored guests, separate from the ruckus of the household. This architectural shift pulled the kitchen along in its wake. If the family was eating in a refined, tapestry-hung room away from the main hall. They didn't want the smell of roasting meat and the shouts of scullions wafting in. The kitchen was pushed further away, down corridors, into basements, into separate wings. It became a service area, not the pulsating heart of the home. The hearth remained, but its social gravity diminished. It was now the engine room, not the town square. Then came the fireplace, not the open hearth, but the enclosed, backed fireplace built into a wall with a chimney. This was a revolution in slow motion. It was more efficient. It directed smoke up and out with far greater reliability, though never perfectly, and it allowed for more than one fire in a building. You could have a fire in the parlor for warmth and light, separate from the kitchen fire for cooking. The world of the medieval peasant, where one fire did everything, heat, light, cook, was, for the elite, splitting into compartments. Comfort was beginning its long, slow divorce from sheer survival. With the fireplace came new tools. The cauldron hanging from a chain over an open flame was less practical for a backed fire. It was gradually replaced by pots and kettles designed to sit on trivets within the fireplace, or on hobs built into its side. The spit evolved from the dog treadmill to clockwork mechanisms, and then to smoke jacks powered by the heat of the flue itself, an elegant, if finicky, bit of automation. These were incremental changes. A cook from 1300 would be baffled by a clockwork spit, but would recognize its purpose instantly. A cook from 1300 would, however, be utterly perplexed by the growing obsession with something that began appearing on wealthy tables in the 16th and 17th centuries, the fork. We mentioned forks earlier as curiosities. Their adoption is a perfect metaphor for the slow death of the medieval culinary mindset. Forks were, for a long time, seen as absurdly effete. Why would you need a tiny two-pronged spear when God gave you a perfectly good right hand? Using one was a statement. It said, "I am so refined, I cannot bear to touch my food. I am separate from its visceral, animal reality." It was the antithesis of the communal, hands-on, tir-en-sop medieval meal. Every time a fork was used, it was a small, silent rebellion against the world of the shared trencher. It took hundreds of years to catch on, of course. Old habits, especially those rooted in necessity and theology, die very, very hard. Meanwhile, outside the manor and castle, change was even slower, but just as inexorable. The open hearth in the peasant cottage persisted for centuries. But even here, the world was nudging its way in. New crops from the Columbian Exchange, the potato, maize, tomatoes, slowly trickled down the social ladder. The potato, in particular, would eventually revolutionize the peasant diet in parts of Europe, offering more calories from less land. But that was a future story. In our period of transition, these were novelties, viewed with the deep suspicion reserved for all foreign foods. Perhaps the most significant change was one of information. In the medieval kitchen, knowledge was oral, practical, passed from master to apprentice, from mother to daughter. It was in the hands and the eyes and the nose. Starting in the late medieval period, and exploding with the printing press, cookbooks began to appear. Not just lists of ingredients for feasts for the rich, but guides for the aspiring middle-class housewife. These books began to standardize, to theorize, to move cooking from pure practice tradition towards something resembling a codified skill. The recipe, as a written concept, started its long ascent. The secret knowledge of the hearth was leaking onto the page. So, what are we left with in this long twilight? A world in transition. The castle kitchen is now a noisy, hot, but distinct apartment. The peasant's hearth still smokes, but maybe there's a potato roasting in the embers, a strange new lump from across the sea. A merchant's wife in a town might consult a printed book to make a grand dish for a dinner party, using a fork she's still not entirely comfortable with. The unity of the medieval experience, where everyone, from lord to serf, was fundamentally bound to the same cycle of fire, grain, and pot, was fracturing. The legacy of the medieval kitchen, then, is not just in our words or our social graces. It's in the profound understanding that for the bulk of human history, eating was the central, all-consuming drama of daily life. It was work, it was art, it was social law, it was risk management. It was never just fuel. The modern world has compartmentalized all of those things. We have food as science, as entertainment, as identity, as politics. But we've lost the visceral, smoky, all-encompassing centrality of it. As we finally close this kitchen door, listen one last time. Under the whir of the modern fridge, the beep of the microwave, the hiss of the gas stove, you can almost hear it. The low, eternal bubble of the pottage pot, the solid thunk of the loaf hitting the table, the weary sigh of the spit boy as the roast finally comes off the fire. It's the soundtrack of 1,000 years. A slow, simple, hungry melody. And with that, the last of the light from the hearth winks out. The history is silent. The night and the rest is yours. It would be comforting to think that the world we've just spent so long wandering through is utterly alien, a museum diorama behind thick glass. But the truth is, if you stand very still in your own kitchen tonight, with its electric hum and its climate-controlled air, you can still feel the ghost of that older, smokier room. The medieval kitchen is not really gone. It's embedded in our instincts, our language, and in the quiet, often ridiculous, anxieties we bring to the very modern act of feeding ourselves. This is not a story of tools, but of shadows. The long shadows cast by a dying fire. Consider the layout. Your kitchen is almost certainly organized around a triangle. The sink water, the refrigerator larder, and the stove hearth. This is a direct, if sanitized, evolution of the three essential stations of the medieval kitchen: the water source, well or bucket; the storage area, pantry, salting barrel, cool cellar; and the fire. The path between them is optimized for efficiency, a principle any medieval cook staggering from well to hearth to grain bin would have understood, even if our efficiency involves fewer spills and less backstrain. Now, open your refrigerator. Look at the light. That cold, electric glow is the absolute antithesis of firelight. But what does it illuminate? Preserved things. Jars of pickles, fermentation. Cheese, controlled decay. Leftovers in containers, the next day's pottage. A tube of tomato paste, concentrated, preserved fruit. Even the act of putting food by, as our grandmothers called it, is a direct neurological heirloom from the time when summer's abundance had to become winter's sustenance. Our fear of food waste, that twinge of guilt over wilted spinach, is the echo of a peasant's genuine terror of an empty grain pit in February. We perform the rituals of preservation long after the necessity is past, because for millennia, it was the difference between life and death. Let's talk about that most modern of rituals, the recipe. We follow them with a peculiar devotion. A pinch of this, a cup of that. Bake at a precise temperature for an exact time. The medieval cook had no thermometer, no measuring cups. They used handfuls, pinches, a good amount, and judged doneness by the sound of bread or the color of meat. Their recipe was experience, weather, and guesswork. Our slavish adherence to written instruction is a product of that later world of print and standardization, but also of a deeper desire to control the uncontrollable. They fought entropy with salt and smoke. We fight it with precise grams and digital timers. The goal, to transform the raw into the safe and the palatable, is identical. We've just swapped intuition for instrumentation. And what of our feasts? A Thanksgiving dinner, a Christmas roast, a birthday cake. These are our subtleties. We may not gild a peacock's beak, but we will spend hours basting a turkey, crafting a perfect pie crust, or decorating a cake with intricate, inedible flourishes. The performance is still there. The abundance is still a display of security and generosity. The anxiety of the host, will there be enough? Is it cooked through? Will they like it? Is the direct descendant of the feastmaster's panic. The Lord displayed his wealth with a heron. We display our competence, our care, our Pinterest worthiness, with a perfectly glazed ham. The language of status has changed, but the meal is still a text to be read by our guests. Even our darkest, weirdest food habits have roots in that sooty past. Clean eating. The obsession with pure, unprocessed, natural foods. This is, in its own bizarre way, a romanticized yearning for the medieval peasant diet before industrial processing, but also before reliable safety, variety, or seasoning. It ignores the fact that the medieval peasant would have sold their one good tooth for a single orange or a lump of sugar. Our modern fascination with foraging for wild garlic or mushrooms is a luxury game, a quaint echo of the necessary, backbreaking work of supplementing a meager diet with whatever the hedgerow provided. They foraged to survive. We foraged to post about it on Instagram. The action is the same. The stakes could not be more different. Then there is the hearth's social function. The kitchen is, for many, the heart of the home again. Not because it's the only source of heat and light, but because we've consciously decided to make it so. We gather there at parties. We install stools and breakfast bars. We call it open plan. This is a deliberate architectural sentimentality. We are trying to recapture the communal gravity of the Great Hall, but with central heating and under-cabinet lighting. We want the warmth without the smoke, the community without the hierarchy, the shared space without the shared trencher. It's a sanitized, curated nostalgia for a centrality we deliberately dismantled centuries ago. So the ghost is there. In the way we hoard condiments in the fridge door, a veritable spice cupboard, far beyond the dreams of any medieval king. In the quiet satisfaction of a full pantry. In the primal comfort of a one-pot stew simmering on a cold day. In the nervous laughter when we present a failed dish. We are still, in our bones, creatures of the hearth. We have just spent 500 years building an elaborate, global, technological system to pretend we're not. The final legacy of the medieval kitchen, then, may be this. It defined the terms of a relationship we can never fully escape. The relationship between humans, fire, and transformation. We've swapped andirons for induction coils, but the fundamental magic remains. We put something inedible or unpalatable into a box of concentrated energy, and through applied knowledge and time, we make it safe, we make it delicious, we make it ours. The fire is now hidden behind a glass door or an electric coil. The smoke is vented silently away. The labor is reduced to a series of gentle chores. But the purpose hums on, quieter now, almost lost beneath the convenience. It is the purpose of turning the chaos of nature into the order of a meal, of asserting control, for one more day, over the fundamental mess of being alive. So, next time you're waiting for the kettle to boil, or staring into the glow of the oven light, remember, you are standing in a direct, unbroken line of succession from that soot-faced cook, that hour-making baker, that weary peasant stirring the pot. You are the beneficiary of 1,000 slow innovations, 1,000,000 forgotten meals. Your kitchen is a cathedral to a solved problem. But the ghost of the problem, the ancient, hungry, cold ghost, still walks its floors. And in your most basic, automatic gestures of preparation, you quietly acknowledge it. You keep the faith of the fire. You maintain the quiet, eternal watch over the hearth. And with that, the ghost fades back into the walls, satisfied. The modern appliances resume their soft, electric song. The history is not just in the past. It's in the click of the stove turning off, the click of the light switch, the final, comfortable darkness of a well-fed home. Our tour is truly complete. The rest is silence and sleep. And so we arrive here, at the end of our long, meandering, deliberately unhurried tour through the smoke. We began with the simple, solid reality of the hearth, the roaring, hungry sun around which an entire world turned. And we end, as all things must, with its last embers, cooled to gray ash. This final part isn't about new tools or new routines. It's about absence, the shape left behind when the central fact of 1,000 years of daily life slowly ceases to be central. It's about the quiet after the fire goes out. Think of everything we've passed through. The weight of the iron cauldron, the gritty grind of the quern stone, the sacred, sweaty ritual of the bake, the regulated chaos of the marketplace, the staggering, theatrical excess of the feast, the silent, desperate calculus of the peasant's pot. We've watched food be currency, status, art, religion, and medicine. But above all, we've watched it be work. The primary, inescapable work of being human. The transition out of that world wasn't marked by a single invention. It was a slow accumulation of separations. The separation of the kitchen from the living space. The separation of cooking from heating. The separation of eating from communal survival. The separation of flavor from preservation. each one a layer of insulation between the human body and the raw, demanding reality of nature. The modern kitchen is the result of all those separations. It is a room of incredible convenience, built on the forgotten memory of profound inconvenience. But memory has a way of seeping through. We've traced its ghost in our layouts, our language, our feasts, and our fears. Yet there's one more place it lingers, perhaps the most poignant of all, in our stories. In fairy tales, the witch's cottage in the woods always has a hearth, always has a bubbling pot. The magic is in the pot. The kind maiden is rewarded with a pot that never empties. The questing knight is given food by a hermit at a simple fire. The fantasy of endless, effortless nourishment is the direct offspring of a history of scarcity. Our oldest stories are hungry stories, and their comfort is always, ultimately, the comfort of a full belly earned by the fire. So, what is the final, sleepy takeaway from our 1.5-hour vigil by this historical hearth? It's an appreciation for the profound depth of the ordinary, for the sheer human ingenuity poured into the simple act of making porridge, for the generations of unsung, unrecorded people whose entire genius was dedicated to knowing exactly when to rake out the oven, or how much salt would preserve a side of pork, or how to stretch a handful of grain to feed a family for a week. We celebrate kings and artists and inventors, and rightly so. But civilization has a much broader, quieter foundation. It was built by people who knew how to keep a fire alive in the rain, and how to turn a sack of barley into a month of meals. Their legacy is not in monuments, but in continuity, in the fact that you are here, listening to this, because an unbroken chain of people, for thousands of years, successfully did the work to feed the next generation. They won the daily, quiet war against rot and hunger just long enough for the chain to continue. Their greatest masterpiece is the present moment, in which their struggles are no longer mandatory for you. As we let this last bit of historical smoke dissipate, the invitation is not to romanticize that past. It was hard, gritty, short, and often brutal. The invitation is simply to notice its echo, to feel for a moment the weight of the pot that isn't there, to hear the silence where the grindstone once turned, to sense the safety in your full pantry that was bought with a million days of anxiety. The medieval kitchen, in the end, teaches us a single, slow lesson, that human culture is, at its most basic level, a series of solutions to the problem of dinner. Every tool, every rule, every ritual we've discussed was an answer to that relentless, daily question. We have since devised dazzlingly complex new answers. But the question, the ancient, hungry, fundamentally human question, remains the same. And with that, we can finally let the subject rest. The hearth is cold. The tools are museum pieces. The routines are fossils. But the echo of their purpose, to transform, to sustain, to gather, to survive, still resonates in the very deepest foundations of who we are. Thank you for staying awake, or perhaps for drifting off. Thank you for spending this time in the quiet, smoky company of history's most essential room. The story of the medieval kitchen is over, but your own kitchen is just down the hall. And in its electric light and its humming refrigerator, it holds the peaceful, conquered ghost of every hardship we've discussed tonight. So go, perhaps, and appreciate it anew, not as a mere utility, but as the quiet, miraculous endpoint of a very, very long journey. Good night. Sleep well, and may your dreams be untroubled by the thought of next season's salt supply, or the proper way to truss a peacock. The watch over the hearth, for tonight, is finally done. Well, hello again. It seems we've both lingered here a little longer than intended, hovering in the doorway of a kitchen that's been dark for hours. The farewell was given, the lesson softly spoken. But perhaps, like the last guest who finds one more story to tell by the dying fire, we have a final postscript thought. Not a new chapter, but a whisper. A look at the ashes, not of the hearth, but of our own understanding. Because the story of the medieval kitchen, like any good history, is never truly finished. It's just waiting for a new perspective to stir its embers. You see, for all our slow wandering through smoky rooms, we've been viewing this world through a lens polished by our own time. We've chronicled the labor, the hierarchy, the grim practicality. We've rightly called it a war against rot and hunger. But what if, for the people who lived it, it was also something else? What if, in the rhythmic pounding of the mortar, in the shared warmth of the hearth, in the familiar, earthy taste of the daily pottage, there was not just struggle, but a kind of belonging? A deep, unshakable sense of place within a cycle as old as humanity itself. We moderns suffer from a pervasive anxiety of choice. What to eat? Where to get it? How to cook it? Is it healthy, ethical, sustainable, impressive? The medieval cook, for all their lack of options, was free from this particular frenzy. The parameters were set by God, season, and Lord. The work was hard, but the purpose was blindingly clear, the path laid out by 1,000 yesterdays. There's a certain peace in that. A brutal peace, but a peace nonetheless. The anxiety was not about choosing the right grain, but about whether there would be grain. A more primal fear, perhaps, but also a simpler one. And in that simplicity, there might have been a depth of knowledge we have utterly lost. A cook didn't just know a recipe. They knew their fire's personality, its hot spots, its moods based on the wood used. They knew their sourdough starter like a living familiar. They could judge the doneness of a loaf by the smell of its steam, the readiness of cheese by the feel of its rind. This was knowledge written in the senses, not in a book. It was a profound, tactile literacy of the material world. We have exchanged that deep, sensory literacy for a broad, shallow, digital one. We know the theory of 1,000 recipes from across the globe, but could we tell if our oven's temperature is off by 10 degrees without a thermostat? They could. So the legacy is twofold. We inherited their problem, the need to eat, and we built a glorious, global, dizzying machine to solve it. But in the process, we may have left behind their solution's hidden companion, a profound, embodied sense of connection to the few square feet of earth and fire that sustained them. We traded a deep, narrow well for a sprawling, networked reservoir. We'll never know which was more nourishing to the soul. This isn't to say one is better. It's just to observe that in our long, sleepy study of their what and their how, we might have missed a glimpse of their why beyond mere survival. The why might have been in the shared labor that bound a household, in the pride of a perfect loaf that emerged from your own hands and your own fire, in the comforting, monotonous certainty of the pottage pot, a constant in an uncertain world. Their kitchen wasn't just a factory for calories. It was a theater of meaning, where every action, from the salting of meat to the blessing of the bread, wove them into a story much larger than themselves, a story of season, faith, and community. Our modern kitchen can be a place of isolation, one person performing a task for others. Theirs, by necessity, was almost always a place of confluence. It was crowded, noisy, frustrating, and warm with shared breath and purpose. So, as we finally close this door for the last time, let's not just see a room of archaic tools and grim routines. Let's see, perhaps, a lost cathedral of sensory knowledge, a stage for a daily drama of necessity that also, quietly, fostered a sense of place and purpose we now spend small fortunes and countless self-help books trying to recapture. The fire is out. The ashes are cool. But for 1,000 years, that fire was a sun, and its light defined a world. We live now in a world of 1,000,000 scattered electric lights. It's brighter, safer, and far more convenient. But sometimes, in our fragmentation, we might feel a strange, ancestral pull toward that single, smoky, central sun. A pull we can't quite name. It's the ghost of the hearth, not just as a tool, but as a home. And with that, the historian truly has no more words. The monologue dissolves into the quiet hum of your own device. The past recedes, where it belongs. The present awaits. Perhaps, tonight, it awaits with a cup of tea, made in a kettle that boiled in seconds, without a single piece of firewood being chopped. A miracle, if you think about it. A quiet, electric miracle, born from a long, long line of smoke. Sleep well. The story is complete. The rest is not history. The rest is yours. Here we are, a place we did not expect to reach. Part 12. In a script designed to be sleep-inducing, we have, perhaps, overshot the mark and circled back into a gentle, waking clarity. But that's fitting, because the final destination of any history isn't in the past. It's in the present moment of the person who hears it. So, for this last, unnumbered, and frankly superfluous part, let us abandon the medieval hearth entirely. Let us turn instead to you. Right now, you are in a room. Maybe it's dark. Maybe a screen glows. You are likely still, listening. Your own kitchen is somewhere in the building where you are. Think of it, not as a historian's subject, but as a living space. Is the sink empty? Is there a hum from the refrigerator? A digital clock on the stove? A forgotten mug on the counter? That room, in its mundane, ordinary state, is the true and final archive of everything we've discussed. It is the museum where all the struggles, against hunger, against rot, against the sheer exhausting labor of transformation, are displayed as solved problems. The light switch is a victory over darkness. The tap is a victory over distance and contamination. The refrigerator is a victory over season. The packet of pasta in your cupboard is a victory over millstones, weevils, and feudal dues. We have spent these hours anthropomorphizing pots and fireplaces, giving voice to silent tools. But the most profound artifact is the silence itself. The silence in your kitchen when no one is in it. That silence is peaceful, not ominous. It does not whisper of tomorrow's uncertain foraging or the dwindling salt barrel. It hums with assured abundance. This quiet is the ultimate historical novelty. For most of human history, a silent kitchen was a terrifying thing. It meant no fire, no pot bubbling, no work being done to secure the next meal. Now, it just means everyone is in the other room. So, this is the end of our long monologue, not with a summary of tools, nor with a poignant metaphor of dying embers, but with an invitation to a simple act of contemporary archaeology. The next time you walk into your kitchen, pause, just for a second. See the toaster not as a cheap appliance, but as the absolute apex of a 10,000-year quest for consistently browned bread without the perils of an open flame. See the paper towel roll as the decadent, disposable heir to the endlessly laundered, grease-stained kitchen cloth. See the bag of pre-washed salad as a miracle that would make a medieval gardener weep with confused joy. Food, cleansed of soil and pest, requiring no labor, no waiting, just consumption. We are the children of that smoky, grinding world. But we are children who have been given the most incomprehensible gifts. Our relationship with food is now almost entirely cerebral, a matter of choice, nutrition, ethics, preference. The visceral, physical struggle has been outsourced, mechanized, and hidden from view. We debate the merits of artisanal sourdough while standing in a room that would have made the actual artisanal baker of 1350 fall to his knees in veneration. This isn't about guilt. It's about perspective. The history of the medieval kitchen is the history of the mountain we no longer have to climb every single day. We live on the plateau that mountain built, and we've forgotten it's there. Our occasional anxieties about food, the what should I make? Dread, are the faint, psychic echoes of a much louder, sharper fear that once ruled every waking hour. So, let's bring it all home. To your home. The story we've told is done. It has unspooled from the first spark of a fire to the glow of your screen. The characters have left the stage. But you remain. And your own, quiet, well-lit kitchen is the punchline to their long, hard joke. The happy ending they couldn't imagine. The historian's work is complete when the past is made to illuminate the present. Not to glorify it, not to condemn it, but simply to make it visible. To make the ordinary seem extraordinary. Because you understand, for a moment, the sheer weight of history that had to pass to make that ordinary thing possible. With that, our task is truly, finally over. The last insight is not mine to give, but yours to have. It's in your next glass of water, clean from the tap. In your next slice of bread, uniform and soft. In the simple, unremarkable act of opening a cupboard and knowing, with certainty, that food will be there. That is the legacy. Not in a museum, not in a book, but in your quiet, well-fed safety. A safety earned for you by every single person who ever stirred a pot over an open fire, hoping it would be enough. And so, it seems, we have talked ourselves out. There are no more tools to describe, no more routines to dissect, no more smoky corners to illuminate. The hearth is ash. The pots are cold. The last servant has long since taken their rest. We have lingered in this doorway well past the point of usefulness. The two of us, you, the patient listener in the dark, me, the voice with a perhaps unhealthy attachment to culinary history. This is the part where the historian, having overstayed their welcome, finally shrugs, offers a last, slightly awkward nod, and steps backward out of the frame. The camera, if we had one, would hold on the empty kitchen, just the stones, the cold fireplace, the silent shadows, and then it would fade, not to black, but to the soft, ambient light of your own space. That's where all history ultimately resides. Not in the past, but in the present moment of consideration. We've spent this time building a very large, very detailed diorama in your mind. A diorama of smoke and effort. Its purpose was never to make you an expert on medieval spits or pottage consistency. Its purpose was simply to exist for a while, to be a place for your thoughts to wander, slowly and without urgency. The goal, as stated at the very beginning, was sleep-inducing, not boring but soothing, like the recounting of a long, complicated task that is now finished. There is a calm in the aftermath of described labor, a peace in knowing that every problem presented, the grinding, the salting, the roasting, the preserving, was, for its time, solved. The story has a built-in conclusion. You are here, in a world that solved those problems differently. So this isn't really a part 13. It's an anti-part. It's the quiet after the monologue, the space where the information settles, and all that's left is the faint, pleasant residue of a journey completed. The Sleepless Historian doesn't end with a bang, or even a whispered moral. It ends with a release. The story is returned to you. Do with it what you will. Forget it. Remember a single image, the glow of embers under a cauldron. Let it inform a random moment next week, when you watch water boil in a kettle. Or let it fade entirely, having done its job of gently occupying your mind for a little while. My job was to talk until the past felt palpable, and then to stop, leaving you with the palpable present, the weight of the blanket, the quiet of your room, the absolute, incredible distance between you and the relentless, hungry fire at the center of a dark age. Our contract is complete. I have rambled. You have listened. The balance is restored. The final word, then, is not a fact, but an instruction. Listen now to the silence that follows a finished story. It's a good silence. A earned silence. It is the sound of history done. Good night.